Okay, so moving on from mapping studies, another formal way of processing this information you find or reviewing the literature is called a systematic literature review. There are two core differences between mapping studies and systematic literature reviews. One is the aim. The mapping study is exactly like it sounds. It's mapping out an area of interest to identify the characteristics, the gaps in that area of interest, or the focuses in that area of interest. Just like von Mayrhauser's mapping study showed that big code bodies weren't studied in software comprehension experiments, for example. Systematic literature reviews, on the other hand, have a defined research question already going in, and they're basically looking for evidence with respect to that defined research question. So one of the first stages in a systematic literature review is to identify the research question and then look at the literature to answer that specific research question. So it's more directed rather than a survey over the area. And I suppose with that directed research question comes a more formal protocol in systematic literature reviews that you're asked to adhere to. You'll see this as we walk through the steps that are presented on this slide, but there's certainly the second difference between a mapping study and a systematic literature review is the level of systematicness, I suppose, thoroughness, rigor, formality that's associated with a systematic literature review. So let's walk through the steps as in the slide. It's the first step is to convert this information need into an answerable question. So you derive your research question. Can we more effectively minimize clinic waiting times for consultants or for patients, for example? Transparently find the best evidence to answer this question. There we go into our finding and filtering steps again, where we do search engine searches, maybe follow references, that sort of stuff. Then we filter that stuff because we'll probably get too much stuff. So maybe we'll decide that only material since 2000, only material written in English. Additionally, we put quality appraisals on that. So we'd look for, as in step 3, evidence of validity, impact and applicability. So we look at the quality of the design, the quality of the reporting, for example, and we say, yeah, this is a good quality study. We want it included in our review. And when we have that full set of papers, we have to do some sort of meta-analysis where we try to relate all the papers to each other in terms of quality, in terms of how they approach the question, to get an overall view of the answer to our research question. This comparison also often includes something called meta-analysis, which is a statistical field which allows the analysis of statistical results over different studies. So you can have statistics in paper 1, paper 2 and paper 4, and you can do a meta-analysis across all those statistics. Again, comparing the papers. Then a good systematic literature review will have an appraisal with experts, stakeholders, and an interpretation of the context of each study and how that impacted on each study. So it will bring it more into reality from controlled studies to the actual world. Do practitioners think this is accurate? What fake circumstances were inserted in the experiment that we still have to check out? Would these circumstances, if not held in the real world, mean that the results are still sound? And then we do a continuous improvement on steps 1 and 4. Eventually, when we're satisfied, producing a secondary review which takes all these primary papers, the evidence papers, and summarizes them according to this analysis here, and generates a literature document, a secondary review, which aims to answer the answerable question. So these 4 steps really are a systematic literature review. There's a small typo on the slide there I'm seeing. It's the first 4 steps equate to a literature review. Let's just change that now. Possibly a nicer representation of the systematic literature review process is presented here. Notice it's broken down into 3 phases, where the first is to plan the systematic literature review, then to carry out the systematic literature review, and then to document the literature review. So, as per the previous slide, the first step is specifying the research question and developing a review protocol, a protocol that you'll adhere to when reviewing all the documents, all the literature you find, to say which documents are filtered out, which documents are retained, to say how you found those documents. Did you just use search engines? Did you just use query terms in search engines? Or did you, for core papers, identify the references of those core papers or papers that cite that core paper? All those protocol issues have to be noted and identified. And then you typically validate your review protocol, typically by running it past your research team or your supervisor. When you've got a valid or a sufficiently valid review protocol, then you start to conduct the review by identifying the relevant research, typing in your queries into the search engines that you're using, by following the references of various different articles, following authors, selecting primary studies that you think are of appropriate quality, both in their reporting and their design, that are appropriate according to your filtering criteria. They have to be written in English. They have to be done after the year 2000 to get more recent findings. You assess the survey quality, and when they reach that threshold, when they're included, you extract the required data from each of those papers, and then you do this synthesis of data where you try to bring all the data together through that maybe statistical meta-analysis, through a more qualitative textual analysis if need be. And then you write the document that is the systematic literature review. You write the review document and validate the report, typically by running it past your research team first, but then maybe by running it past the journal review committee, so the peers who will review journal articles. My one problem with this representation is that it's very linear, when in truth you'll find something here when you're selecting your primary studies that you'd forgotten about when you were designing it, so you'd probably end up doing a lot of iteration through this process, going back up to higher stages, even though the model seems to suggest it all falls downwards. So, it seems like a great idea, these systematic literature reviews. Why don't we all do them? I suppose the problem is the scale. Even when we typed in some search terms on our ACM, Business Search Complete, those search engines, we ended up getting thousands of papers back. So finding the papers, filtering the papers, all huge tasks. SLR, huge task. So the first task is finding the relevant papers. You've got to decide what are the appropriate engines that you want to use and what are the queries you want to type into each of those engines. And even this is a difficulty, because if you type in exactly the same query into, say, Google Scholar as maybe the ACM, you get slightly different output, because they don't interpret queries in quite the same way. So you might say, term X and term Y or term Z. Does that mean term X and Y or Z? Or does it mean X and Y, or you can replace the two of those with Z? So those query formation tasks, you need to be very careful with them when you're pumping them into different search engines. Then once you get this list of papers back, you've got to prune to the best evidence, I suppose. And there's a lot of criteria here. The first is relevance, predominantly relevance to the research question you've posed, because that's why you're doing this literature review. But even then, you're talking about inclusion, exclusion criteria used as a filter. I mentioned language, I mentioned time, but there could be, since 2010 or since 2000, but there could be other criteria used as a filter. Maybe only journal articles are acceptable to you, or journals and conferences, maybe not workshop articles. Then you've got to look and decide on the quality of the reporting. Can you actually tell what they're saying, or is it too difficult? And can you, do you feel safe in the quality of their empirical design? When they carried out this empirical study to find the answers to their questions, did they do it rigorously? And when they reach that quality threshold, then I suppose they end up in your set of primary papers. If they're relevant, if they fit your inclusion, exclusion criteria, if the quality of reporting and quality of design is high enough, then it's a primary paper. Then you've got to do the hard stuff, which is the comparison. Based on very critical reading, you've got to figure out what they're saying under what contextual circumstances. And then you've got to take all these, what they are saying under these different circumstances, and try to integrate them into a whole. And that framework for comparison is often very, very difficult to form. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that a systematic literature review, it's probably of too big a scale for an MSc dissertation, either in health informatics or in software engineering. If you were doing a systematic literature review, that's all you would be doing. You'd be doing a literature review of the area, trying to find the best evidence for a certain approach. Maybe the best approach for a certain goal, and then you'd be trying to find the evidence that suggests which one of all the approaches that have been proposed is the best for a certain goal. In fact, there are some cases of master's dissertations being done that are SLRs, and one particular one I'm familiar with is, let me just go down. This first reference here, it's a paper by Mark Turner, and it's discussing a systematic literature review of paired programming to teach introductory programming, which was a master's dissertation. So it's a meta-analysis of the guy who did a systematic literature review for his MSc thesis. What were the issues he found? Well, he found that scaling really was a huge issue. The number of papers he had to go through in a limited period of time. So he limited his selection to papers that were electronic only. He then cut them down by randomly selecting a sample from that selection of e-papers that he could get. So it wasn't really a systematic literature review, it was more a sampled literature review. Found a lot of problems in this issue that publications do not always equal empirical studies. Politically speaking, academics are under a lot of pressure to publish, and the more publications you have, the more likely you are to get promoted. So typically, people spread their publications out. They might do enough empirical work for 2 publications, but they'll try to get 3 or 4 publications from it. So the first paper will report on empirical study 1. The second paper will report on empirical study 1 and point 4 of the new stuff. The next one might report on a bit of empirical study 1 and a lot of empirical study 2, maybe the whole lot of it, so you get 3 papers out of 2 studies, and the student found that very difficult to deal with. As a by-note, the student found journals and conference paper differences very difficult to deal with as well. I think someone didn't sit him down and say what the difference with a journal and a conference paper is, but of course we've covered that at this stage, so you know the difference, so you wouldn't have had that problem. But yeah, the scale of the thing was huge for the student involved, and it really was very much a sample systematic literature review in paired programming to teach introductory programming. It's when 2 programmers sit together and try to learn programming together in the labs. But it was very interesting to see how feasible it was. There's also a nice interesting paper on using mapping studies in software engineering. Barbara Kitchenham is behind it, but David Budgeon would be another leading author in this area. And both of those are available online in something called ppig.org. More general guidelines are available on SLRs from this article, this paper that Barbara Kitchenham has written, Guidelines for Performing Systematic Literature Reviews in Software Engineering. And I acknowledge that this slide is sort of software engineering orientated, so here's my concession to the health informatics people. It's an interesting review on systematic reviews. So it's taking all the systematic reviews that have been done on health information systems and reviewing them and coming up with some interesting findings. So that's an interesting read as well. So just before we leave systematic literature reviews, I want you to think of the lecture materials so far and wonder if there's anything we've heard of so far that was a systematic literature review. I'm going to pause for about 3 seconds to let you think about it, or pause the video yourself and let you think about it for a bit longer. But have a think, because we've come across it before. Okay, so I'd argue that Lutz Pritchard's reanalysis of the software comprehension, where he tries to find the difference between individual programmers that I covered in the first lecture and presented as good research, is a systematic literature review. He gathered all the primary papers on software comprehension. He went back to all the authors, asked them for their data, reanalyzed that data, did a meta-analysis across studies, and came up with the best answer he could from the existing studies on his question, what is the actual variability between practitioners when trying to understand code. So I think that ticks a lot of the boxes for a systematic literature review, and I would argue that it's one of the best papers I've read, but also one of the earliest attempts at doing a systematic literature review in software engineering. So while I've pointed out these formal literature review processing approaches like mapping studies and SLRs, SLRs are probably out of scope unless it becomes your whole dissertation. Mapping studies may be a bit more relevant, but they're sort of frowned on by the research community slightly because they're less formal than systematic literature reviews. I personally like them, and I'd be happy to supervise a dissertation in that area. But a more realistic approach is presented in the Saunders book. More realistic, certainly, for an MSc dissertation. If you're doing a PhD these days, you would be expected to do a mapping study / SLR, I imagine. But Saunders et al. Put a more pragmatic approach across in their critical review. The core of it is a sort of a two-phase step, or two-phase process, where you have a preliminary research review, where core papers are identified, and you read those first, and you roughly refine your research question. They don't really talk about how you identify these core papers, but if you're doing your dissertation with a supervisor, they should be able to give you some guidance on what the core papers in that area are. Likewise, a quick Google search with some very relevant terms will show you the papers that have had huge citation indexes in your area, huge numbers of people citing them, and that would point you towards their centrality in the field, for example. So then when you get your preliminary research review done, then they suggest that the researcher carries out a more holistic but still representative, not totally encompassing research review, which is critical in nature to incrementally refine the research question. Why not holistic? Because there's a huge amount of literature out there, and in the scope of a master's dissertation, you're really trying to show that you can do research, not that you've reached the state of mastery over a total field. So you can't be expected to get all the literature that's there. You would be expected to find the core literature and very representative literature of the field, but not an exhaustive set of literature in the field. So they have this nice figure in their book. Oh, there we go. And the figure should be followed from the bottom up, in that you have a very rough idea of your research questions or your objectives, and then you define parameters. So parameters are sort of like the filtering criteria we talked about in an SLR, the language of publication, the subject area, maybe even the sub area, the publication period, the literature type, maybe just empirical studies, or maybe just algorithms, maybe just qualitative studies of how practices were put in the field and how that worked out for them, sort of like those health informatics people's second paper. Then using those defined parameters, you're in a good position to generate and refine the keywords that you'd be doing with your search, and not just the keywords but the key queries, I suppose, that you're going to put into those search engines. You also want to define at this stage the search engines you're going to look at. You conduct your search, which is typically the easy part, because you just type those search words and into those search engines that you've identified, and you obtain a body of literature, and you evaluate that literature in some way towards I suppose your original research questions and objectives, really, and see how well they fit. And the truth is that this can change your research protocol for finding other articles, but it can also change your research questions and objectives slightly. So you record your findings there, which might result in a slight change here, might result in a slight change in the search protocol you're adopting. So that allows you to start drafting a review of how you're going to carry out your second iteration. Here you redefine the parameters, regenerate the keywords and the search engines you're going to look at, reconduct your search, re-obtain the literature, re-evaluate, re-record, and then update and revise the draft again. And you keep going until you've reached a point where you're happy that you have achieved this representative sampling of the literature. And that's sort of, I suppose, represented by these circles getting smaller each time. The refinements are getting smaller each time. So what then is the purpose of the critical review? Well, I suppose it's like a mapping study to identify key points and trends in the area, to identify gaps and explicit recommendations for future work. So sometimes authors will put in the future work section, and you'll notice that often they never get to revisit that future work in later publications. So that's maybe an area that you could work in. So that's a good place for a research question. It allows you to stop repeating others' work. If someone's done it before, then you're not advancing research, you're not really doing research, you're just being sloppy in your literature review. So I suppose those three can be grouped together under the fourth term there, to define or refine your research question. So that's very much the mapping side of it. Once you get a research question, of course, you can go around again and you can further refine your research question. And ultimately, when you find answers to your research question, when you design your study, you typically have to go back to the literature and try and contextualize your findings in terms of the literature. So there will be more critical review after your findings as well. Then, when you have your research question, you might want to find an appropriate empirical method. You can find this from the literature. Someone probably has done something similar to what you're doing. A good example is the Vickers paper I gave the software engineering people. The authors needed a test for perceived workload, how participants felt put upon, how much effort they felt they had to expend, and their musical ability. For their perceived workload, they cited a NASA paper which talked about the perceived workload of astronauts, that they used that test. For musical ability, they made up their own, and it included questions like, do you sing in the shower? Which one of those do you think is more defensible, more foundational? I'd argue that the first one, the NASA study, where they've probably done it fairly rigorously and generated a document on it that has been peer reviewed, that sounds like a safe empirical method to use. Making up the one which includes singing in the shower doesn't seem to me to be quite such a good empirical method. It's not vouched for by the academic community. So in terms of good research, you should find approaches that have been used by other people and adapt them for your purpose. So you can do a critical review to find the appropriate empirical method as well. I suppose there are two central beliefs in research. One is that you should have a theory and evaluate it. If you believe that, then you should read the literature towards developing the theory, and that's called a deductive approach, where you deduce a theory from the other literature that's been read. But another school of thought or another school of research suggests that you should work from the data only, and in that case you should, your theory should arise from the data rather than from the literature that's out there. And in that case, it's more an inductive approach where the data forms the theory, and maybe too much literature actually biases you towards a specific theory, so that's not seen as such a good thing. In those cases, you would still do a critical literature review, but it would be towards understanding an area, being more broad in that you have enough knowledge to understand the data you will get so that you can form the theory in that area. So that's more inductive from the data, with the literature providing context that allows you to interpret your data correctly. We'll talk more about that in our paradigms lecture. Okay, so how to do a critical review then? Well, I suppose this is sort of how to read articles. First thing I would say is that you do the previewing, establishing how or if it will inform your works. That's sort of a filtering step. But beyond that, when you've decided that it's that you're going to keep that article, you've got to figure out how it particularly pertains to your work, the work you're going to carry out. When you're reading, I'm a strong advocate of highlighting and annotation. So highlighting, using a yellow marker to say this bit's important, I need to focus on this bit. But annotating is even more powerful, writing little notes in the margin as if you're talking to the author. Why did you do this? Why didn't you do that? In fact, one of the best collaborations I've had is with an author from America. And the reason it all started off was because I sent her an email saying, I'm sorry, I just can't see why this figure in this paper is relevant. Are you sure this is can you explain it to me? And she wrote back and said, actually, the editors put the wrong figure in. So we built up a relationship based on that. I understood her work much better because of that. And I found it very funny that 5 years after the paper had been published, no one else had pointed this out. But annotating is a powerful tool because it not only says this bit's important, it also says this bit's important and here's what's important about it. So I would say annotating is highlighting an asset. It's better. Summarize, of course, the paper. Sort of fits in with previewing. Summarize it for your purpose. What is it telling you? Re your work. Compare and contrast it to the other literature in the area. That's a very powerful tool because you're not reporting on individual papers. You're reporting on a body of work, and you've got to build up this overall picture of a body of work, which involves comparing and contrasting to other work in the field. And be transparent so others can replicate or even extend or improve as time goes on. So be transparent in your keywords, your search engines, your following reviews, following references, if you follow references, if you forward cite from 10 core papers, say what those 10 core papers were, why they're your 10 core papers, and identify in the text all those issues, those protocol issues, but also the issues you had with the papers and I suppose the issues that you found from annotating the papers. Sort of as we've been doing in week 1, sort of as you'll have to do for week 4. Sorry. So, just to finish off then, a checklist for your critical review. Is the literature covered relevant to your theme, and are the leading theories covered? Something you'll probably have to assess with your supervisor really, in terms of are the leading theories covered, but you should be able to identify whether the literature is relevant to your theme and how it's relevant to your theme. Have you assessed the strengths and weaknesses in this work and been objective even to the point of including differences to your own opinion? So if you're just reading literature to validate your own opinion, then you'll read literature to validate your own opinion. You will miss the stuff that doesn't tally with your own opinion, and you'll be stuck in the same opinion you started off with, the same position you started off with, and that's not academic research because you haven't learnt anything. You haven't, changed your opinion. When you read all the literature, you'll find things are much more nuanced than you think they are. Have you justified your own possibly resultant ideas through showing gaps, inconsistencies, needs for testing in the current literature? So what I'd suggest you do is have a look at case 3 in the Saunders book, page 103, for a good illustration of criticality. I'll hopefully put a photograph of that page up on the resources, and you can have a look at it. It's a really good illustration of how to be critical when going at something in a business context, but it's still very interesting. Okay, that ends the lecture material for week 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you again week 3.